Before they were legends. Part 7. Steve Jobs, the college dropout visionary. Picture this. A young man walks barefoot across a college campus in California. He has no money, no degree, no clear future. He sleeps on friends' floors, collects empty Coca-Cola bottles for food money, and walks 7 miles every Sunday just to eat one good meal. Most people would call that failure. But this young man believed something strange. He believed that the future could be designed, that machines could become beautiful, that technology could feel human, and that one person's vision could reshape the world. That young man was Steve Jobs. But long before Apple, before the iPhone, before billions of devices, Steve Jobs was simply a college dropout searching for meaning. And his story almost never happened. This is the hidden story of the restless, rebellious, and sometimes miserable years that created one of the most legendary innovators in history. Because the truth is, legends are not born in success. They are forged in confusion, rebellion, and obsession. And Steve Jobs' journey began with abandonment. February 24th, 1955, San Francisco, California. A baby boy is born to 2 graduate students. They are young, unmarried, and terrified. His biological parents are Abdul Fattah Jandali, a Syrian student, and Joanne Schiebel, an American college student. At that time, their relationship was unacceptable to Joanne's family. So the decision was made. The baby would be given up for adoption. But Joanne had one condition. Her son must be adopted by college graduates. A couple was selected, but at the last minute, they backed out. So the baby was given instead to Paul and Clara Jobs. Paul was a mechanic. Clara was a bookkeeper. Neither had gone to college. Joanne refused at first, but Paul and Clara made a promise. They promised they would send the boy to college someday. Only then did she sign the papers. And just like that, Steve Jobs began life with a strange truth. He was both chosen and rejected. Years later, Jobs would say something revealing. He never thought of himself as abandoned. Instead, he said, "I was chosen." But the emotional complexity of adoption stayed with him forever. It created something powerful, a deep belief that he was different, that he was meant for something extraordinary. The Jobs family moved to Mountain View, California. At the time, this area was still quiet farmland. But something important was happening. Companies like Hewlett-Packard were beginning to grow. This region would later be known as Silicon Valley. But for young Steve, it was simply home. His father Paul taught him something crucial. Paul was a mechanic who loved building things with his hands. Together, they worked in the family garage. Paul showed Steve how to take apart machines, understand electronics, fix things with precision. But Paul also taught him a deeper philosophy. He once told Steve, "When you build something, even the parts that people can't see must be beautiful." This idea stayed with Jobs forever. It became one of the core principles behind Apple. Because Steve Jobs didn't just want technology to work. He wanted it to be elegant. School was not easy for Steve. He was brilliant, but he was also bored. Teachers complained he was disruptive. At one point, he was nearly expelled. But one teacher changed everything. Her name was Imogen Hill. She noticed his intelligence and began challenging him with difficult work. For the first time, Steve felt stimulated. Within a few months, he skipped 2 grades. But socially, he still struggled. He felt different, disconnected, restless. Jobs later described himself as someone who always lived between worlds, part engineer, part artist, part rebel. And that combination would define everything he later created. Meeting the other. Steve in high school, Jobs met someone who would change his life. A quiet, shy electronics genius named Steve Wozniak. Wozniak loved building computers. Jobs loved ideas and possibilities. The two became instant friends. They shared something rare, a fascination with technology, but also a rebellious spirit. One of their earliest projects was almost criminal. They built a device called a blue box. It allowed users to hack the telephone system and make free long-distance calls. At the time, phone networks operated using specific audio tones. Wozniak figured out how to replicate them electronically. Jobs realized they could sell the devices, and they did. The two college-age friends sold dozens of blue boxes. It was risky. It was illegal. But it proved something important. Technology could change systems, and people would pay for it. Years later, Jobs would say, "If we hadn't built the blue box, there would have been no Apple." In 1972, Andy Jobs enrolled at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. It was an expensive private college, and his parents were paying with their life savings. But within months, Jobs became restless again. He didn't see meaning in the required classes, so he made a shocking decision. He dropped out. But he didn't leave campus. Instead, he began dropping into classes that interested him. One of those classes would change history. Calligraphy. Yes, calligraphy. The study of beautiful lettering. And the class explored serif and sans serif fonts, typography balance, visual harmony. Jobs became fascinated. Years later, he would say, "It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle." At the time, it seemed useless. Computers had no fonts, no typography, no design elegance. But a decade later, when Apple built the Macintosh, those ideas became the foundation for modern digital typography. Every beautiful font on your computer today traces back to that moment. But at the time, Jobs was still broke. Very broke. Dropping out had consequences. Jobs had no dorm room, no money, no clear path. He survived by returning Coke bottles for deposits, sleeping on friends' floors, and once a week, walking 7 miles across town to a Hare Krishna temple. Why? Because they offered free meals on Sundays. These were hard years, but they were also deeply transformative. Jobs explored philosophy, spirituality, and creativity. He read books on Zen Buddhism, meditated. Now he experimented with alternative lifestyles. He even traveled to India, searching for spiritual enlightenment. What he found was not exactly what he expected. India was chaotic. Poverty was everywhere. But the experience forced Jobs to confront something powerful. Life wasn't about comfort. It was about clarity of purpose. When Jobs returned to California, he needed work. He got a job at Atari, one of the earliest video game companies. But Jobs was not easy to work with. He was brilliant, but blunt, difficult, and intense. Coworkers often complained about his behavior, so management made a strange arrangement. Jobs worked the night shift when fewer people were around. But even there, something important happened. Atari asked him to design a more efficient circuit board for the game breakout. Jobs brought the project to Wozniak. Together, they redesigned the hardware. The result was extraordinary, a much simpler design. But this project planted the seed for something bigger. A realization that computers didn't have to be giant machines owned by corporations. They could be small, personal, and accessible inside the Jobs family garage. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak begin building a computer. Not for corporations, not for universities, for ordinary people. At the time, computers were intimidating, large, complex, and mostly used by specialists. But Jobs believed something radical, and computers could become tools for creativity, for artists, for thinkers, for individuals. Wozniak built the hardware. Jobs focused on the vision, and together they founded a company. They named it Apple. Why Apple? Jobs later said he simply liked the word. It sounded friendly, non-technical, human, which was exactly the point. Their first product was the Apple I. It wasn't even a complete computer, just a circuit board. But something unexpected happened. A local computer store ordered 50 units. Jobs convinced suppliers to give them parts on credit. They built the computers in the garage and sold everyone. Soon came the Apple II. This machine was revolutionary. Color graphics, user-friendly design, a complete system. For the first time, a personal computer felt approachable. Sales exploded. By the early 1980s, Apple became one of the fastest-growing companies in history. And Steve Jobs, the barefoot college dropout, was suddenly a millionaire. But the story was far from over. Because success would soon bring conflict, failure, and exile. Despite Apple's success, Jobs was still young, only in his late 20s. And leading a massive company required skills he was still learning. His management style was intense, demanding, sometimes impossible. Employees described something called the reality distortion field. Jobs had an uncanny ability to convince people that the impossible was achievable. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it caused chaos. Eventually, internal power struggles emerged, and in 1985, something unbelievable happened. Steve Jobs was forced out of Apple, the company he founded, the company he built, the company he believed in. Gone, just like that. For many people, this would have been the end. But for Jobs, it became the beginning of his second act. After leaving Apple, Jobs founded a new company called Next. At first, it struggled. The computers were beautiful but expensive. Sales were slow. But something unexpected happened. The software developed at Next became incredibly powerful. Years later, Apple would buy Next and bring Steve Jobs back. But that is a story for another time. When people talk about Steve Jobs today, they often focus on the triumphs. The iPhone, the iPad, the Macintosh. But the real story began much earlier. In uncertainty, in poverty, in rebellion, in a young man wandering through college campuses without direction, collecting bottles for food money, sleeping on floors, searching for meaning. Because the truth is, innovation rarely begins with certainty. It begins with curiosity, with questions, with the courage to walk away from the expected path. Steve Jobs once said something powerful. You cannot connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backward. The calligraphy class, the garage, the blue boxes, the spiritual search, all those scattered moments eventually connected and reshaped the modern world. But at the time, they looked like nothing more than a dropout's uncertain journey. And that may be the most important lesson of all, because somewhere today, there is another restless student, another dreamer who doesn't quite fit the system, another mind wandering between art and technology. And history has shown something again and again. The people who change the world are often the ones who first appear lost. The world remembers Steve Jobs as a legend, a visionary, a pioneer who helped shape the digital age. But the truth is, before the fame, before the billions, before Apple became one of the most powerful companies in history, Steve Jobs was simply a young man searching for direction, a college dropout, sleeping on floors, collecting bottles for food money, trying to understand his place in the world. And that may be the most powerful lesson his story offers. Because the path to greatness rarely looks impressive in the beginning. It often looks like confusion, like failure, like uncertainty. But sometimes, those uncertain years become the foundation of something extraordinary. If you enjoy discovering the hidden struggles behind legendary lives, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because there are many more stories the history books only tell halfway. And the next one might surprise you. Until then, stay curious, because every legend has a beginning.